change challenge mean in the urban context? Climate change is a bit amorphous. It's a bit like sustainability. It's a bit like resilience. It's not a very helpful concept unless we nail it down more specifically. And I think it exists at two very different levels, and it's the difference that is important. There is the global risk of climate change and the role that cities play in being big consumers of energy and making significant contributions to emissions. On the other hand, there is the role that cities could play, if they are dense cities, in terms of efficiency. By grouping lots of people together, you can actually get efficiencies in those systems. The urban paradigm of North America, like Los Angeles, which is urban sprawl, it relies out-of-town shopping malls and transport networks, and has about 30 households per hectare, is not going to achieve any of those efficiencies and is going to contribute enormously to emissions and energy consumption. In contrast, somewhere like Hong Kong has 10 times that number of people per hectare and therefore can achieve enormous efficiencies. So the planning of cities has a huge role to play. But that global risk is not very meaningful to people living in cities where they are facing day-to-day challenges in terms of water security or energy security. And many, many of the cities in the developed world, even cities that are capital cities, Bangkok, Manila, are facing this duality. You know, the lights go out, there's uncertainty in terms of power. Some people have access to water, others don't. So the key thing about climate change in cities is how does that manifest itself locally? And again, talking about temperature rises, sea level rises, increased rainfall isn't very helpful. We need to get specific. In Gorakhpur, on the Asia Cities Climate Change Programme, they are very clear about this. They are used to flooding. They can manage, they've adapted. But the problem is that the floodwater now stays for 5 days before it retreats, rather than 3. And those extra 2 days are the straw that breaks the camel's back. In Semarang, in Indonesia, they have a current problem. It's an alluvial coastline. And the ground is sinking as a result of groundwater abstraction. And it's predicted between now and 2050 that it will sink by 11 centimetres. Overlaid on that, climate change predicts that the sea level will rise by 20 centimetres. So it's made it 200% worse, the climate change issue. In that city, there's also a donor-funded project to improve the drainage that hasn't taken account of the climate change factor. The solutions need to be grounded specifically in the locations. And there are different strategies or different development pathways that we can think about to address these problems. The real issue, and the issue that I'm most interested in, is the issue in the developing countries where there aren't any services and the cities are already sick. I think we are going to be seeing what I coin urban collapse happening again and again and again. In cities where there isn't enough water, where maybe climate migrants are coming to the city, increasing the speed of urbanization, and we have breakdown in the city system. And what we need to be doing is recognizing that we, as engineers, as planners, as the international community, are not going to solve these problems remotely. The solutions are going to be conceived within the cities, for the cities. The Asia Cities Climate Change Network has been a really important program for Arup to work on because of the influence on our business in learning that very, very directly from working in 10 cities in 4 different countries. And the solutions that are emerging from cities range from the defensive prevent and predict infrastructure, seawalls and dikes, to actually, let's just introduce rainwater harvesting in this city, because that will mean that there's household water available that isn't impacted by floods and therefore enables people to drink potable water and be healthy, even in the immediate aftermath of a flood. The building block for resilience is at the community level. And that's the thought I want to leave you with. We are talking about cities, but tomorrow I go to Bangkok, which is a very different city to Bonn. You know, can we really talk about them in the same breath? I don't think we can. But within Bonn, within Bangkok, within Samarang, within Gorakhpur, those cities are made up of communities, of households, 500 households, 700 households, 1,000 households. These are the building blocks of cities. And I believe that if we are going to address urban climate change resilience in cities, we need to address it within the terms of community building blocks and what those communities need for their well-being and the role of the city in supporting that or empowering that or enabling that.
As in the last years, the topics of climate change and urbanization became more and more important. We just restructured a bit of our company to be more to the point to look at how we as Siemens could help to save or to abate CO2 emissions at our customers. We even set ourselves internal targets which are to be 20% more energy efficient within the next year compared to 2006. And, well, we think that this is quite a good step forward to help industry and to help also cities to be more sustainable, only by using today's available technologies. If you apply the most energy efficient technologies, you always save money on energy costs, and therefore 2/3 of the technologies we were looking at are paying for themselves. So it's not only ecologically feasible but also economically feasible. We teamed up with the Economist Intelligence Unit and produced a series of so-called green city indexes. And using this methodology, we were looking at how sustainable cities are currently and what are their environmental governance and policies for the next future years. Doing this, we were looking at 8 different categories and assessing cities on the categories of energy and CO2, building and land use, transportation, but also on issues like waste management, water management, sanitation, and air quality to get a real broad picture about how sustainable cities are currently. The last study we published was the one for Asia, and we found out that Singapore is the most greenest or most sustainable city in Asia, and we were looking at 22 different cities which are the political or the economical centers of the countries. And while you now could say, well, okay, Singapore is really a very rich city, so they can afford buying the newest technologies, the most sustainable technologies. And well, indeed, we found out that there's a quite good correlation between how wealthy a city is and how good they perform. However, this would bring us to the next point that you would say, well, if a city gets more and more richer, then they would also consume more. But the nice thing what we found out was that there is a threshold level in Asia. If cities are getting richer, up till a per capita income of about 15,000 euro, they will indeed consume more resources. But if they're getting even more richer, they're not only being better in our index, but on average, they also consume less resources, which is, I think, a really good message, because we all want to be more wealthier and would develop. And actually, the developing countries, they need to develop, but we have the great threat that we will, well, even use more resources if we get richer. But if you see that there's a threshold level, and if they're above this level, we don't need as much resources as we did before, I think this is a point we could build on, and this points out into the future. And I think it would be, or could be, a positive future. In Asia, the countries, or even the cities, they get more and more aware of the environmental issues, and they have really good and comprehensive environmental guidelines implemented. The cities which are performing really good, they have really found out a way to really enforce their policies. And the other countries who are not, or cities who are not doing so well, they didn't really find out how to enforce their regulations.
The reason why this presentation is also very relevant is that if you want to find a solution quickly for the world, then in my opinion you need to address the problem from, say, at least 3 different angles. So top-down, working with governments and how do you help them to be as efficient and effective as can be. Then bottom-up it is extremely important. But then what I would call through the middle, that is where the business world has to play a very important role. Because actually the corporate world are the only ones really, because of competition, who've become really effective and efficient in implementing stuff. So the more we can help businesses to shift their focus in the direction that Siemens and Arup are already taken, the better it gets.
I'm part of an academic sort of a group of people that call ourselves those arguing for cities as a force for good, CFG. The idea being that the cities are seen as the producers of a lot of crime and waste and all that sort of stuff. But cities have also been, throughout civilization, the points where most of the creativity has taken place in society. In fact, the word civilization itself somehow ties up with this kind of concentration of people working on some of, on values and other things in society. Now, the reason I put up this diagram is, to talk about what I call, Marcus is here from Colorado, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but this rain in Colorado, talk about policy, I always bring this up. With a friend I was driving, and far off there was a thundercloud, I said we're going to drive straight into that thunderstorm. And the friend laughed and said, listen, we'll go there, we'll go right through that, but you'll notice it'll be dry. And lo and behold, we came to that place, and it was dry. And what was happening was, well, Colorado, like much of Nepal, Himalaya, and the higher altitudes in Trans-Himalaya, in Tibet, it's high, it's dry, it's got low pressure. So what happens is when the rain falls, not all the rain, but quite often, the rain falls and it never hits the ground. It evaporates before it hits the ground. I find this extremely powerful metaphor for much of the international and national policy making. Millennium Development Goals, all kinds of protocols, you have all thunder and lightning, every national channel is talking about it. And you go to a place like Nepal and go to a village there and nobody's even heard of it and nobody cares. Okay? And life goes on. And life does other things. Now, it's not to say that international commitments like MDGs, or not MDG in particular, but similar things have not worked. The Ozone Treaty has worked. The Rhine cleanup next door here, it has worked. But how have they worked? And there are lessons to be learned from how they've worked. They have not worked from having more and more international commissions and big bureaucracies. They have worked because people have found creative, complex ways of negotiating and doing things. It needs a perspective shift in us, and we need to talk about what I call toad's eye science. Too much of the academia right now is fixated on what we call the eagle eye science. Talk to any young person joining the university, and the first thing, especially in engineering, I don't know how it's here, but anywhere in the world you talk and the first thing they want to do is GIS, they want to do all this fancy mapping and all. It's understandable, it's really fancy computers and do all that work. The trouble is, that's part of the truth. It's one particular view. And if policy is based totally on the eagle eye science, it misses everything that's happening on the ground. And what's needed on the ground is the kind of shift